Welcome friends and colleagues. This is the first time after 15 or 14 seminars, webinars that all happen on Zoom. First time we are doing an India Studies, India Center webinar that is also seminar in person at Flame University. Welcome those who are here. Welcome all those who are on Zoom across the world. It is a great honor for me today to welcome not just virtually but in person Professor Gregory Booth, one of whose articles I had reviewed about a decade back, and today is with us here at Flame University. He's here now third time, I'm told, but first time after I joined Flame University here in Pune, India. He is professor of Indian music at the University of Auckland and has been engaged in the study of Indian music and culture for more than 40 years. He is the author of 2 books, Behind the Curtain, Making Music in Mumbai's Film Studio, Oxford University Press, 2008, and Brass Baja, Stories from the World of Indian Wedding Bands, Oxford University Press, 2005, as well as numerous articles on music and film industry in South Asia. He co-edited the 2014 OUP publication, More Than Bollywood, Studies in Indian Popular Music. He is currently studying India's music and film culture industries, focusing on a wide range of factors including intellectual property, technology, industrial structures, and the music-film relationship. I'm sure we'll see some of the glimpses from his forthcoming book today in his talk. Welcome, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to Pankaj for organizing sort of a last-minute kind of a thing when we found out we were coming. I've been working in India for a while. Different kinds of projects in different parts of the country, more north than south. Looking at different kinds of issues. Technology has always been one that's interested me, and money is one that's interested me, as well as music. And that interest has come out in many different ways. And at the moment, I'm less being a professor and more being a dean, which means I don't do as much of the research as I would like. I don't get here as much as I would like. I don't write as much as I would like. My plan is, God willing, that I will be doing another book, and that book will be a book that's sort of about this topic that I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm using this talk as a way to help me think about this and get my thoughts together and work out some of the issues that I want to address. So you're all helping me by being guinea pigs a little bit, but that's okay. My interest really has to do with what everybody knows the world system theory people. And I've always been interested in this. I love Brunel. Brunel is a great writer, just as a writer, or as translator is a great writer. I'm not sure which it is, but either way, I've always been fascinated by that approach to history, that approach to talking about change. And of course, Emanuel Wallerstein coming after that. They're both very European-centric, as we all understand. Part of it is the time they were writing it, part of it is the resources they could find. Janet Abu-Lughod tries to deal with some of that issue and expand the time frame and also the global reach beyond Europe. And she does a great job of it, I think. But the idea of India in the context of a world system or a world economy, or Indian music in the context of a world economy, is something that interests me. And that's what I'm trying to think about and talk about today. More recently, in case anybody hasn't read it, if you haven't read Anirudh Thanasethi's book on the Deccan in the pre-Mughal world, it's a very interesting approach to history, but it's also a very interesting approach to positioning India in the world system, because he goes out of his way to do that. both Coromandel, Malabar coasts, he points out how India, even central Deccan, is connected to a world system at particular times in particular ways. So the nature of scholarship, and I don't need to tell anybody in this audience, is changing around that whole issue. So more and more we're seeing how India is connected and has been historically connected to the world system. So broadly speaking, this is kind of my interest. And as a musicologist, sometimes I'm going to say ethnomusicologist. Ethnomusicology has at best a mixed reputation in India for a variety of reasons that we don't have to worry about today. But that's the label that I get that's on me, so I live with it. I've lived with it all my life. But whether I'm a musicologist or an ethnomusicologist, my interest is how music works out in the context of a world system. The other word that everybody talks about, the word that everybody uses, right? The globalization word. And my sense of it is that based on the things that my students write, and probably your students write, it's one of the most confusing words on the planet at the moment. And it's a word that people use in lots of different ways. I use it in a very economic sense. I follow, Ajahn, who's very clearly talking about the money, the global flow of capital, as the thing that defines globalization. In managing how we talk about this, especially in the world of culture, I'm trying to make the argument that the cultural change follows the money. KFC is here not because of KFC as culture, but because KFC is a corporation, because of that global flow of capital that's pushing KFC or allowing KFC to flow into India in a way that perhaps it wasn't able to do earlier. And after that, the culture around food in India changes. Of course, KFC changes too, but the culture follows the money. This is part of my argument. Of course, culture also follows politics. And when we start talking about globalization, we start talking about world systems, we move through historical periods, we get to the point where we're talking about colonization and colonialism. And one of the things that fascinates me is the extent to which the music industry in the world, from its inception, was connected to colonialism. That's what Marshall Solins calls a historical conjuncture. They came along at the same time, and they took advantage of each other. And it's quite an interesting story in itself. And to some extent, it starts when the two big companies emerge from the very early melee around who's going to control the music industry. And America, Victor Talking Machine emerges as the winners, and in the UK it becomes the gramophone company. And those two companies are the two big majors initially. And what's fascinating is in 1907 they divided the world between them. They drew two big lines down a map. One down the middle of the Atlantic. They had a meeting. They sat together, took the map out, and they drew lines. They drew one line down the Atlantic, they drew a second line down the Pacific, that then took a hard left to encompass some of East Asia, as well as the Pacific, as well as the Philippines. And then they said, okay, that part of the world belongs to Victor, that part of the world belongs to the gramophone company. Now, as you can see, the part that belongs to the gramophone company is not unrelated to the British Empire at the time of 1907, right? So that connection exists right away between this kind of commerce and the way the colonial structure is working in the world. Those kind of commercial agreements never last forever, but it lasted for quite a while, and it defined the way a lot of the world worked in terms of the musical economy. And it meant that from the beginning, India specifically was part of a global music economy controlled by Britain, controlled by the gramophone company. Let's do that. That's all right. Nothing's happening. There we go. So when we look at the music And the older music industry, the pre-47 music industry, we're looking at an industry that's part of a colonial system. And the company, the gramophone company, and the Victor talking machine the same way, were explicitly looking at local stuff, local product that they could harvest and package and resell to colonial subjects for the benefit of the colonizing power. Just like ITC, I mean, no different than ITC. They were just selling a different product, right? The guy in the middle, the guy in the white suit, is the guy who did a lot of this work in India, a man named Fred Gaisberg. And in 1902, he took a recording machine, which was the same as the playback machine, basically, out across the world on a recording tour, recording music in different parts of the world. And this is a very famous quote. It's not, you've probably seen it before. It's on Michael Kinnear's website and various other places. He didn't know what he was listening to anywhere. I mean, he was in Japan, he was in India, he was all over the place. He didn't know, he had no clue. He relied on local expertise to get him the recordings. The masters got sent back to the UK, or actually to Germany for pressing, and then the discs got sent back out here to be sold in India. A colonial project, straightforward. And by and large, that was the nature of the Indian music economy, or India's place in the music economy, through the British Zamana. India is also important because India is the home of the first pressing plant outside of Europe and the world, right? They built their first plant in Shalda, and then in 28 they moved out to Dum Dum, to what had formerly been a military hospital. And until recently, if you drove in from the airport from Dum Dum in Kolkata, you still saw the smokestack. It's gone now, I'm pretty sure. But anybody know? Anybody drove that way recently? Yes, there are many people around. I've seen that. But they've sold it off for housing development, which is going to plan all along. But that's another story. Anyway. So India had a really central role in a global economy because they were the pressing plant that pressed not only for India, but for a lot of East Asia, for a lot of Africa, and all of the sort of West Asia, Central Asia part of the world. So they're doing a lot of work as part of a global system controlled by the UK. And I put this together. This is roughly geographical in a vague sort of a way. As long as you don't get too carried away with it. Pressing plants. And you can see that the Kolkata plant was built very early on in the whole project of a global music economy. The little yellow ones are just sales agencies. And what is also interesting about this is if you draw a line like that, basically below that line is the British Empire. Right? British East Africa, British West Africa, British South Africa, Egypt, India, and then through Southeast Asian colonies. Don't forget that America got Hong Kong, Victor got Hong Kong, so China's a separate story. So the industrial structure of the gramophone company looked like the British Empire, to a large extent. And it was part of that same project. And that continues pretty much until 1947, of course. Now, I put this in because Kedar yesterday was talking to me about brass bands, and so I've done some work on brass bands, and it's worth talking about because they help us sort of think about India as part of a global music economy, a global music culture. And the brass bands are a perfect example of that, right? They're part of the colonial cultural impact that followed the money. And I just picked these two slides at random. One's, I think, probably early 60s. The Munchan band is probably from early 1960s. And the other one I took a couple of years back at my friend's house in Amritsar. But now it's part of its Indian culture. But it comes out of that colonial project like a lot of other things do. But what's interesting really about brass bands and a lot of things is the extent to which they reflect both India's incorporation in a global music culture and its separation from that culture. Take it away.
Provided for this reality. What is that?
Okay.
Pankaj, might I suggest a radical thing, which is you upload this recording to the website.
Okay. We'll get the recordings. Fine.
Zoom can be,
Good point. Okay. I'll just carry on. We'll do without sound. It's not a big deal. Anyway, the thing I'm saying is that the brass band business, as such, only exists because of the combination of India's incorporation of the global culture and its separation from that culture. And what I'm really interested in is the separation, because that's the thing that fascinated me from the first time I showed up in India in '84, when India was very much still separated from the world music economy, or the world economy in many ways. Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of the history of this, because you all know this history better than I do, but what's interesting is the impact of the separation of India from the global economy on music and culture. That's what I'm interested in. Here's the main culprit, right? And his accomplice. So Mahalanobis, right? And the other guy, he's less well known. It's B.V. Keskar. Right? Now, we all know about Dr. Mahalanobis, very important figure in Indian history, central role in the planning commissions throughout Nehru's term and time in office, the 5-year plans, so forth and so on. Keskar was Minister of Information and Broadcasting for most of the same time, and between the two of them, they had a big impact on music culture in India. All that was never their intent. Well, it certainly wasn't Mahalanobis' intent. It was Keskar's intent, although it didn't work out the way he planned. And it affected everything that was going on. Partly it affected classical music in India and how classical music's history in the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, played out. Indian classical music, as we all know, has a long history as an elite music, as a music of the aristocracy, as whether that's the secular state or the religious establishment, but big history, high level of investment over the centuries. That investment begins to decline in the first half of the 20th century, in the end of the colonial era. Independence happens, and then along comes Keskar, who was a great fan of classical music and pushed that. And he pushed it, through the radio and his control over AIR. He was, obviously, we understand, part of that support for classical music meant that throughout the country, radio stations paid musicians. There were musicians on staff at many of the radios, many of the local stations. Now, that happens at a time when staff musicianship was disappearing entirely in the rest of the world, and it just goes the opposite way. And what that meant was, certainly for the first 2 or 2.5, say, decades of independence, was that classical musicians had support that they would simply otherwise not have had at all. And it kept them going long enough for other parts of the Indian state to kick in, such as ICCR, Indian Council for Cultural Relations, and their support for touring artists, and the musicians' discovery of the West as a source of income. It gave enough time for people like Pandit Ravi Shankarji and Ustad Yakar Hasan to keep going while they discovered the West and discovered the Western audience as a source of revenue. And it gave a new life really to Indian classical music at a time when otherwise I think it probably would have been, who knows what would have happened, but it would have been easy. And it survived through the 20th century in part because of state support, India's state support. The other thing about Keskar was that he was, of course, quite anti-film, as you all know. So he limited the amount of film song that could be broadcast. He created a second censorship board that censored the songs that could be broadcast. And he made the argument, as that's just a little quote of his there, the vulgar song concocted of irrational cocktails. And I'm not going to play it. You all know Diwana Parwana from Albela. I like to think that that's the song he was thinking of when he said that. Because that's 51, he said that in 52. I don't know if that's true yet, but it's fun to say anyway. It's a great scene. I'm not going to play it because we're having technical difficulties. Anyway, it's easy enough to find. It's the second plan that's especially interesting because it's the second plan that really had an impact on the music and film industry. And of course, in India, you can't talk about the two as separate. I just listed some of the things that actually affected that side of the industry. Now, when Mahalan Nobis made the plan, he was not thinking about music. Consumer goods, as we all know, were very low on his list of things that mattered. He was basically interested in big capital investment. I mean, that's a whole story that, again, you don't need to be told. But in the course of doing what they were doing and trying to build a particular vision of an Indian state, a particular side of planning, they created a set of circumstances that had an enormous impact on how music and popular culture emerged in India. It wasn't what they were planning to do at all, but that's what happened. And everything that happened afterwards and what we still live with today happened is because of the unintended consequences of what they did at that time. The film industry was not an industry. It did not have industry status. That changed the way financing works or worked. It made every film a life and death matter for the producers. It led in the 80s, as you probably all know, to the whole black money laundering business. It was enormously high risk. People lost their houses all the time. They went out of business routinely. The line was, you make a film, you lose money, you declare bankruptcy, you start a new company and make another film. But it made for a very particular kind of production logic. And of course, the famous story of Raj Kapoor and Joker and all those things. So it was a very high-risk enterprise. It made technology very difficult to acquire. So the Indian film industry and the Indian music industry were technologically behind, and that had impacts on how the songs came out. And I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean that almost in a good way. In America, the joke was a single is 2 minutes and 53 seconds, because that's what you put on a 45 RPM disc. In India, that limitation never existed. You could make your song as long as you wanted because you were recording on celluloid film. And you were not going to sell discs, you were selling the movie. It changed songs, popular music in lots of ways. One of the other really important things about how the plans worked was because imports were so hard, because it was so hard to get foreign films in and licensed and distributed, the Indian film industries didn't have any competition. They existed in a competition-free environment. Free of competition, but high risk. And they were a very conservative industry therefore. And people who write about, everybody who writes about films talks about that, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s time, how conservative, how tightly, culturally bound the industry, the film industry was. Musically, the same thing happened. After 47, basically the only company left standing in the country was the Gramophone Company of India. They owned the only pressing plant in the country. They had total control of the music industry in India. Because of that, because of the fact that they were being provided free songs by the film industry, we never had the development of an independent popular music tradition in this country. Never happened. There were guys playing rock and roll in the cafes and the pubs in Mumbai and Delhi and various other places, but they were basically just playing covers. And they were playing for audiences that were very elite audiences, and they were singing primarily in English. There was never an independent popular music industry until things began to change, of course. The sound, the genres, all those things changed and were quite unique. None of the kinds of change that developed in global pop industries happened in India. And of course, there was no independent music structure. There's no popular independent structure at all. So it's a very difficult, a unique space, a culturally unique space because of the context that the plans created and that the license rights created. No competition, limited music, there was no market. People, by and large, people didn't buy discs. The gramophone company didn't have to worry about it, and they didn't. And of course, there was no engagement with IP law for any realistic sense of the matter. So film composers could copy what they wanted from anywhere, and nobody was going to care. And they did. Just a couple of quotes to talk about some of these issues. Biman Mitra was one of the managing directors at GCI towards the end of the time in the 70s. And then Shashi Gopal, of course. Looks like he's introducing Dara Mehendi there. But the structure, the Indian government said, okay, you can produce cassettes, but you have to export 75% of them. And nobody was going to buy them, and so the government pushed the whole popular thing down, the whole music commodity industry down. They made it almost impossible for them to survive. And basically nobody tried to survive, they just carried on. The entire music industry was subsidized by the film industry. GCI was subsidized by the film industry. I don't have to say much about this because you know this story, but Akashwani takes off, Kesker comes along and puts his regulations in place. 5 minutes later, Radio Ceylon is in business, broadcasting Hindi film songs. 5 years later, Vivid Bharati. Right? All responding to the fact that there's no other way to get access to the music and there's no other way to get to the audience. All of those situations created by India's isolation, in fact. It was not until 1970 that the GCI monopoly was officially broken when Polydor showed up. Polydor never actually had a big piece of the market, but they did pretty well, and they survived for 10 years before they became Music India. But what always amazes me when I think about Polydor, and I asked this of Lazarus, and he couldn't answer the question either, what on earth made Polydor think about entering the music industry in India in 1970? I mean, they must have been out of their minds. I just simply can't understand it. I'll come back to that one in a minute. The other thing that defined Indian culture through the 70s into the 80s and 90s, a big issue, huge issue in the industry, was the matter of version songs. And I just grabbed these cassette covers because they're two good examples. The bottom one, of course, is a version song, version recording, right? It's Burman songs re-recorded. The one on the top, not. But it's in the details on the cassette covers that matter, right? The version recording tells you, if you read the fine print, that you're not getting the originals. The important part of that line is recorded as per provisions of the Section 52 of the Copyright Act. Version songs were legal. They were entirely legal in terms of the Indian Copyright Act. They just didn't make any sense in India, because we'd only ever heard one version of any song. Gramophone company tried to fight back, as you can see, original film soundtrack recording. They had a very hard time. And the version business really pushed GCI to the wall, gramophone company to the wall. But they brought it on themselves, I think, in many ways. Again, other business. One of the things I've been doing in the past while is trying to make sense of how this looks in time. What happened when? As India was engaged and not engaged with the global industry. And there's a guy named Baladev Nair, who some of you perhaps know, who writes about economic history, who talks about the 70s as the radical era of the license Raj, when things were really quite extreme. And then Mrs. Gandhi tries a couple of years to liberalize things and then goes backwards. Polydor shows up right in the middle of the radical era of the license Raj. As I say, I don't know what on earth they thought they were doing. They survived for a while. Super Cassettes comes along in 78. Super Cassettes is T-Series, right? T-Series was operating a separate principle. They knew how to operate in India. They didn't worry about the kind of industrial structures that the internationals did, and were quite successful because of that. Yeah, well, there. This is Shashi Gopal talking about him trying to get the Warner license approved, just as he was leaving Gramophone Company and starting Magna Sound. And he got it approved in the end. They eventually gave up, but he got it approved for a while. But it was almost impossible. It was impossible for both him and for Warner Electric, because they couldn't function in the restrictive environment of the late license Raj. It's not until the 80s that the environment begins to open a little bit, the economy begins to open a little bit. And what I'm doing here is, again, trying to track things. So in 1981, Polydor leaves, and Lazarus buys him out and becomes Music India. CBS shows up for 2 years, but this is also the period in which you see a lot of local Indian companies emerging. Because in this first part of the license liberalization, the argument is that liberalization benefited the internal economy, the Indian companies. So you get Venus, you get Pan, you get Tips, all those people showing up. Crescendo, Milestone, all Indian-owned companies created by local entrepreneurs. The internationals don't show up until the end. The internationals show up when liberalization is pretty much done. So it's not until the 90s that we see Sony, we see MTV. Warner Electric comes back on their own turf in 1997, and then Universal in 1999. 1999 is the same year that GCI finally becomes Sade Gama. 95 is the year EMI finally gets out of the business. But this is where we are now, more or less. The big internationals now that own all the music in the world, own all the music in India in the world, with the exception of Sade Gama, who are making their money on songs that they were given 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. What I'm trying to work out is the picture of the coming and going of the relationship of Indian music to the global economy, and the changes that brings with it. And this is an almost endless topic, so I'm just trying to cover the sort of general framework of it and look at sort of the methodological thing of what does it look like if we trace that history. Because if we talk about, because this is really the end of the fiscal era, right? If we talk about contemporary reality, the things that happen about 1999. The airways are deregulated, FM radio shows up, 2G phone systems become possible, and the music industry survives on ringtones and downloads for a while. Eventually we get to 3G, and we get to streaming, and we get to the global economy that we all live in today. But the global economy that we live in today is still inhabited effectively by the music that was created in this period where India's situation was unique. It was unique because it was separated from the impact of globalization. And at the time, I kind of kept feeling that regardless of the reality of it, Nehru was right. I mean, he was doing the right thing in a way if he was trying to protect global Indian culture. It was never going to work, but it was probably the thing to try and do because in a way they succeeded. They succeeded for, eventually they lost, but in the short term and medium term, they succeeded in protecting Indian culture, protecting Indian popular culture and classical culture from the impact of globalization. There are a lot of negative effects to the whole license, Roger, and I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just trying to say that it had a particular impact on music, on all kinds of music. And the music that we live with and listen to today emerges from that protected space, that protected period of time. And it's quite a unique thing in that way. So that's really the extent of my argument. For whatever it's worth, I thank you all for listening to it. I'm happy to talk about it or take any questions or be corrected about anything anyone wants to correct me about. As I say, it's just the beginning of this project. I mean, because we can look at so many different pieces of it. The classical piece is a whole story in itself, right? The whole industrial piece is a whole story in itself. Nobody's really talked seriously about folk music in India. Folk music was another thing that was pushed by the state in the years of independence, the first couple of decades of independence, and it was broadcast repeatedly. How that worked, how that affected folk musicians around the country. Nobody's worked on that story either. There's so much of that stuff that hasn't been told, that whole story. Anyway, that's me, thank you.
Some questions, I guess.
Anybody wants to ask anything? Yes?
Michael.
Yeah, I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah, so a few questions in terms of the world systems theory and looking at music. So when you look at the colonial period as a whole, but there were several other musical traditions, say the princely state, other musical traditions which were not necessarily colonized in that sense. I work on the princely states, so the princely states had their own musical traditions, and following the capital as well. So there was flow of capital from the princely states into this kind of production. Don't know about music production, but I can talk about films. So there was flow of capital from the princely states flow of capital from the princely states into film production. So I was wondering if is there some such because I'm also interested in the radio aspect of pre-47. So not necessarily in the national framework, but the smaller radios which existed. So can you talk whether was there a flow of capital from other sources? If we keep the colonial framework aside, was there any other way we can track flow of capital into music production itself?
Well, the interesting thing about the film industry, as I understand it in the British time, was that the British were doing what they did. They were pushing English films, right? Largely for the local English audience, but to some extent being consumed by the Indian audience as well. The Indian films were all local productions. I mean, we're shooting a couple of people aside, being consumed by the local audience. You're right about the Prince Estates. Kolhapur, was it? Yeah. Who invested in that? Yeah. But they're investing in local production, right? They're not, and that's not flowing outside.
No, actually, it does flow outside. Maybe not in terms of like huge numbers, but there is a flow of from the smaller princely states into, because there was a huge market for this kind of princely films. The whole fascination for the princely world itself.
Yeah.
So there is flow outside.
Outside of India.
Yes,
Yeah,
outside
yeah.
of India as well.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if there is something that of that sort in terms of music as well happening. I'm not aware. I'm just
Not
wondering.
much. I mean, Gramophone Company sold most of its Indian language recordings in India. All right. I'm sure they did some attempt at marketing in the UK. They probably wouldn't have done much. There was not a big population, Indian population in India before that time. But by and large, no, is the answer.
I have a context of things that basically a lot of culture export, music export, or film export from to and fro between India and its world in a system which is licensed Raj or before that. If you don't look at the formal structure of economy and the sanctions and whatever, much of this happened through other ways.
Yeah.
You know?
Happened through?
Other ways.
Yes, other ways.
Now the other ways is basically the port cities,
Yeah.
where a lot of to and fro of general public happens.
Mm.
And through the seas, a lot of things came from outside into India. So if you see a lot of international content, whether it is music, whether it is films, whether it is anything to do with art and cultural exchange, happened around the port areas.
Happened around the port.
Port areas.
Yeah.
Now, which is kind of underground in a way,
Mm.
and not through the formal structure of economic existence,
Mm.
is my understanding at the time when it was not so liberalized, where a lot of exchange you see. So at the surface, it can be Gramophone Company of India, which is the label that existed literally in all records. But much, was available in India beyond that, because these were the pathways through which it came in.
Yeah.
That's my context, saying that those need to be explored in terms of how the country got influenced, in the areas of music, in the areas of film, and the travel and the port cities play a big role. And the second thing I feel also that plays a big role as a part of study when we are doing something like this is also the bureaucratic spaces where these regulations are applied. For example, Delhi itself, you have an underground market where you see a lot of stuff related to music, technology, and areas. Just under its nose it exists.
Yeah, no,
and they are like a hub of a lot of international
Sure.
access, but not in the port. But it has culturally and economically affected that period in terms of exposing India to these areas.
Yes.
Otherwise,
Yes,
those
that's
are the
absolutely
other
right.
routes
Yes.
that are always there, and it is known to be doing that
Yeah.
very
You have a cousin who was
vocally
an air
in
hostess?
India. So, huh?
Right, I say, do you have a cousin who was an air hostess?
No.
Okay. That's the joke, right? Yes, you can't really build a wall, right? You absolutely can. I mean, only you have to look at the film to see that you can. But what the license Raj did was it made it impossible for culture to function, for foreign culture to function economically in India. All right? You're absolutely right about that, because it wasn't that there were no films. It wasn't that people were not getting discs. I mean, was it Stanley's in Mumbai? Was it Stanley's? I think it was. It was a place that sold used discs that tourists brought along with them and stuff, or that people brought in and sold. So there was always some of that. And there was and that stuff was always being translated and interpreted in the movies and in the songs.
That's what I mean, actually.
Absolutely.
It might come like that,
Absolutely.
but the moment it finds its place in the popular movie making as though unorganized, as an industry, it's reaching out to the entire Indian public, and therefore
absolutely.
its presence is felt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it wasn't functioning economically.
Economic.
That's what I'm saying. But you're absolutely right about that. It wasn't that we had
Yeah.
nothing from the foreign world. It was just that it always had to go through that filter.
So just a suggestion or maybe a question is, the industry status, while it is in 2001, if you look at the local, like say for instance the Madras or the Karnataka or those industries, they were constantly negotiating with the government.
Yeah.
So if you only look at Bombay, the picture which emerges is yes, but there were like there were subsidies, there was special regulations which these linguistic states were doing for film industry. I'm talking about film. So what emerges if we just look at the nation versus what emerges when you look at these other industries, which are production-wise in terms of capital as significant, like in terms of the number of films produced, in terms of the revenues, they're as significant as Bollywood or the Bombay-based film industry, but their negotiation was more local.
You're talking about the Chennai industry.
The Chennai or the Karnataka or the Hyderabad,
Yeah.
they were constantly negotiating with the states.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So,
Everybody was, yeah.
while the industry status at the larger status, of course, is a national aspect, but at a local, there's a lot of acknowledgement by the state and stuff. So I wonder if the picture which emerges when you look at all of these negotiations versus the national framework would be different.
Sorry, Professor, at our chapel we have only one music professor, and he has to leave before he leaves.
Even I have to
So I would
class.
like him to present a small token to you. Professor Samir Dugle
Okay.
would present a small token to Professor Gregory Booth because he has to leave.
Good. Thank you. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
That question answer can continue.
Uh,
I think Kedar has a question.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, you can go ahead. I have a
think
class.
something, this is, part like a technologically determinist argument, partially an argument about bureaucracy and legalism and how that creates
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
But I mean, something I'm really missing from this talk is like, how does that change the form of music in India, right? How do the aesthetics change
Oh,
because
yeah,
of that?
absolutely.
And I feel like
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we're from a literature background and we are obsessed with talking about historical context and how form functions within historical contexts.
Yeah.
And so, like, I mean, obviously, well, I guess she's off now, but there is, I have in my mind Zinat Aman singing objects like Koi Mere Zindagi Mein Aaye, the Baat Ban Jaye, which is obviously Russian disco. I just wonder how form changes as these kind of things.
That's all. I didn't even go anywhere near that simply because it's a whole separate talk. What I'm trying to work out is the framework in which that happens.
Okay.
But that's all I'm doing.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Because of course. I mean, that's what I'm saying. That framework created that stuff. It made it possible for that stuff to exist the way it existed without being overwhelmed by American or British pop.
Right.
Directly. Indirectly, yes, as this lady was pointing out, but that indirectly saved a lot of the stuff.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Because you're right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just found myself wondering if cultural forces kind of make that framework flex a little bit, exert some kind of reverse pressure on the stronger determinisms of the world systems framework. And two patterns in particular were on my mind during your talk. One is counterculture in the US.
Was this?
Counterculture,
Yeah.
the countercultural moment, the Ravi Shankar moment,
Yeah.
right? Which you can't separate the success of Ali Akbar Khan in California from the figure of the pot-smoking Orientalist hippie, right? Who at least think that they're the antithesis of the consumer boom that produced them, right? And so on. And the second is, South-South resonances. Resonances between points within the global South.
Oh, yeah.
So there are times when Ethiopian jazz sounds a little bit like old Bollywood music,
Yeah.
or when it goes to Egypt or Afghanistan, it's at least half familiar, it's not
Yeah.
totally alien. So in both cases, it's tempting to say, okay, it's geopolitical forces come first. That's like the original determinism. And therefore financial flows, and therefore the direction of cultural flows, right? From the periphery to the core and vice versa. Do you find yourself hesitating a little bit when you think about the hippie in California or South
Well,
Australia?
certainly the second part of your argument, yes. I mean, I forget the song, but I mean, LP doing covers of West African pop, right? So culture traveled, the commodities traveled, the cassettes traveled, and when they traveled, people got a hold of them and made use of them. So yeah, absolutely, and it wasn't just America, UK, there was a lot of, they listened to a lot of stuff. The Middle East, I mean, Shankar Jaikishan loved. Yeah, what's the name? The brothers? The Lebanese brothers. Anyway, I can't think of it, but they love that music, but the stuff coming out of Lebanon especially. So there was a lot of that. I mean, it's much bigger than just that hegemonic thing, by all means, absolutely. The counterculture is a big piece. That's kind of what, frankly, Pandit Ravi Shankarji discovered. It was not why did he go sit in California? It's not a coincidence that he ended up in Marin County, because that was the place where all the hippies ended up, in effect.
But also California's a land of, the opposite of high culture in the Northeast, right?
Yeah.
So, you couldn't imagine Ravi Shankar ending up in Connecticut, for example.
It would have been harder. Yeah, it definitely would have been harder. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
They didn't succeed in New York, also. In New York also they succeeded. Right? Ravi Shankar and all, they also performed a lot of concerts in New York.
Well, Ravi Ji never sat down really. He always traveled, and he always came back here.
Okay.
Right? Al-Akbar Khansa is a different story. He had a different view of the world, you could say. Yeah.
I have a question. Looking at the timeline, actually, 2007 is also when the independent Indian, the alternative music scene, which is the rock and the pop. Is that something that you're considering talking about?
I didn't get into, again, I
Right.
was trying to just sort of do that frameworky thing, but
Right.
Even with cassettes, 85, when Chacha Gopal takes off with cassettes,
Yeah.
right? Or Gulshan Kumar.
Right.
That's all. What's interesting is that's the time the government is supporting small industry.
Right.
T-Series got away with what they got away with because the government would give them a license and wouldn't give GCI a license.
Right.
Because they were a big industry and T-Series was a small industry. So all that stuff plays into that. So that
Right.
whole initial wave of pop that comes out, the Hindi language stuff that comes out
Right.
in the 80s and the 90s,
No, I meant more along the lines of Shankar Ehsan Loy, who had jazz bands and now became, Hindi film music
Yeah.
composers and the other.
the interesting thing about that, as you say, not Shankar, but certainly Ehsan and Loy were both rock and rollers. They played rock and roll. Right?
Yeah.
If you'd left them alone and they could find a way to make a living, they would continue doing so.
Right.
They ended up in the film industry because that's the way you still make money, at least until recently, in India as a musician. You work for the film industry because that's what the money is.
Right.
And that thing drove that. So yeah.
Right. And the fact that there is a thriving alternate music industry now. So I was wondering whether you're going to address that.
Well, now, quite honestly, now I don't know who's making money from music. It's a whole different ball game. In 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, the music industries were trying to figure out what was going to happen after physical format.
Right.
And getting into streaming, but streaming is still unclear as an actual revenue source.
Yeah.
You talk to the guys at Saba and Ghana, and they're sort of saying, well, they're going from year to year, Every year they have to find a new investor. Saba's still talking about investors because they're not really making enough money to post profits otherwise.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.